Welcome to Chronicle Forge.
In 2014, in Arctic waters where light disappears after a few meters, search teams detected a shape on sonar. At first, it was just geometry, then timbers, deckline, and the unmistakable architecture of a Royal Navy vessel. This was HMS Erebus. In 2016, HMS Terror was found as well. Those discoveries changed everything and solved almost nothing. Coordinates are not conclusions. A wreck can prove location, orientation, and material condition. It cannot narrate every choice made by exhausted crews under compounding stress. The years between departure and loss still contain silence. The Franklin expedition, therefore, remains both evidence-rich and explanation-limited. That combination is why the story endures. Mid-19th century Britain treated polar exploration as strategy, science, and status at once. A workable Northwest Passage promised shorter maritime options, symbolic control over unknown space, and prestige in an age where maps and power were inseparable. Arctic missions before Franklin had produced real gains. Coastlines were charted, hazards were documented, institutional confidence increased with each partial success. The operating assumption became clear. With enough planning and discipline, uncertainty could be managed. Franklin's mission emerged from that momentum. It was less a reckless exception than a logical extension of imperial method. Before the Franklin expedition sailed, the Arctic had already taught the Royal Navy a difficult lesson repeatedly. Progress in polar regions rarely follows linear expectations. A season that appears favorable in one year can become prohibitive in the next. What appears to be navigable water from a distance can become compressing hazard when wind, temperature, and current align against movement. Yet, institutions naturally reward successful pattern recognition. When a strategy works often enough, it becomes doctrine. Doctrine then shapes procurement, training, and command assumptions. This is not irrational. It is how large systems stabilize. The problem appears when doctrine treats uncertainty as noise instead of signal. Franklin entered the field at a point where institutional confidence had accumulated faster than adaptive flexibility. That distinction is subtle in planning rooms, but brutal in extreme environments. It is also crucial to understand the social theater surrounding exploration. Expeditions were not only technical missions, they were public events tied to national self-image. Newspapers, scientific circles, and political actors all had stakes in how risk was narrated. A mission framed as bold but manageable attracts support. A mission framed as structurally underdetermined invites hesitation. Public narrative can therefore influence operational framing long before a ship encounters first ice. This does not mean propaganda caused the tragedy. It means communication ecosystems shape what kinds of uncertainty institutions are willing to foreground. Franklin commanded at 59. Crozier and Fitzjames carried major operational responsibility beneath him. This was a disciplined naval hierarchy, not a romantic one-man gamble. Officers, engineers, surgeons, marines, and seamen operated in a system designed to absorb stress through routine and rank. That system gave structure, but structure has limits under prolonged environmental pressure. Later retellings often over-personalize causality, as if one temperament could explain a multi-year disaster. Evidence suggests broader mechanisms: environment, logistics, health, time, and narrowing options. Competence mattered. It just wasn't enough. Command in extreme settings is often misunderstood by hindsight. Viewers tend to ask, who made the fatal mistake? A better question is, what decision environment made robust choices difficult? Officers operate under information constraints, role expectations, and cultural norms that determine how quickly dissent can become action. In some organizations, warning signals travel rapidly upward. In others, signals are delayed by hierarchy, confidence bias, or uncertainty about consequences. Naval command of the period prioritized discipline for good reasons, but discipline can become rigidity if conditions shift outside expected bands. Human factors include more than leadership temperament. They include fatigue management, social cohesion, trust in specialists, conflict mediation, and how teams interpret ambiguity under stress. Two officers may read the same conditions differently and both be acting rationally from their position. When records are incomplete, assigning clean intent is unsafe. What can be said with confidence is that decision quality under prolonged cold, poor recovery, and declining morale is never static. It degrades. The Franklin case likely included that degradation, but without complete logs, we should resist fictional certainty about specific conversations or turning points. The ships were heavily adapted for polar duty, reinforced construction, major provisioning, and steam-assisted capability. For the era, this represented high preparation, but preparedness is conditional. It works against expected stress. It can fail under prolonged compounding stress. A design robust for one season can become brittle over two unplanned winters. Maintenance burdens rise, fuel assumptions shift, medical and nutritional risks broaden, and labor capacity erodes. The expedition demonstrates a familiar systems pattern: strong start, delayed recognition of compounding risk, shrinking options. Victorian engineering projected confidence, and not without reason. Industrial-era Britain had transformed manufacturing, transport, and naval capability through intense technical innovation. To send reinforced ships with advanced provisioning into Arctic waters was consistent with a broader belief in engineered solvability. But every technology has an environment of validity. Outside that envelope, performance can fail gradually in ways difficult to detect from inside the system. Consider the distinction between nominal capability and sustained capability. Nominal capability is what a platform can do under baseline assumptions. Sustained capability is what it can continue doing after repeated stress cycles with constrained repair, uncertain fuel dynamics, and shrinking healthy labor. In frontier operations, sustained capability is the real determinant of survival. Franklin's architecture looked formidable at departure. The question is, how quickly sustained capability eroded once entrapment and attrition began to interact. The departure carried confidence. Families wrote in the language of temporary absence. Institutions planned for return with results. Hardship was expected. Disappearance was not. After the final 1845 sightings by whalers, the external trail faded. In a pre-instant communication world, that silence expanded season by season, changing public emotion from patience to concern, from concern to alarm. Silence became the first major event of the tragedy. When communication stops, institutions do not experience silence uniformly. Families experience immediate emotional discontinuity. Administrators experience delayed procedural concern. Public discourse oscillates between patience and speculation. Over time, these timelines collide. That collision can produce pressure for action, but it can also produce noise, competing claims, rumor cycles, and overconfident inference from weak signals. In the Franklin case, silence became a field of interpretation. Each small clue carried disproportionate narrative weight because the baseline information supply was so thin. Under such conditions, stories can outrun evidence. Responsible historical method, therefore, slows down at exactly the moment public appetite for decisive explanation increases. That tension between method and appetite is still visible in modern media crises. Franklin chronology relies on anchor points rather than continuous logs. Historians and archaeologists build reconstructions from sightings, documents, material evidence, and later search findings. Between anchors, probability rises and certainty falls. Arctic navigation under pack ice is dynamic. Open lanes can close quickly. Seasonal timing can determine whether a ship progresses or becomes fixed for months. Retrospective straight lines on maps are often illusions of hindsight. The next anchor, the Victory Point note, is pivotal because it concentrates confirmed facts into a few devastating lines. The Victory Point record establishes core facts. Franklin's reported death in June 1847, abandonment plans in April 1848, and a survivor count at that moment. Few historical documents carry so much explanatory weight in so little text. Yet the note is not a full narrative. It provides outcomes, not complete mechanisms. It cannot on its own resolve specific medical progression, leadership debates, weather sequences, or minute operational decisions. This is where the story shifts from missing to system failure in progress. A short historical document can be overused in two opposite ways, treated as total explanation or treated as mere symbol. The Victory Point note should be treated as neither. It is a high-confidence anchor inside a low-continuity archive. Its strength lies in explicit reported facts. Its weakness lies in compressed scope. Good interpretation keeps both in frame. One practical way to communicate this on-screen is to pair each key line with a confidence tag. For example, high confidence, reported date statement, then low confidence, unrecorded intermediate causes. This protects viewers from false closure while preserving narrative momentum. It also models intellectual honesty as an active process, not a disclaimer buried at the end. Attrition in extreme environments is cumulative. Calories, sleep, health, fuel, maintenance capacity, and decision quality interact. A problem in one domain spreads to others. Medical burden reduces labor. Reduced labor affects upkeep. Delayed upkeep increases exposure and risk. Under prolonged confinement, even disciplined routines become expensive to sustain. What begins as manageable strain can become feedback loop. Catastrophe here likely emerged less from singular shock and more from converging deficits. Complex failure rarely announces itself with a single irreversible moment. More often, it presents as manageable anomalies that become linked before anyone can re-establish margin. A delayed maintenance task seems minor until labor drops further. A nutritional shortfall seems containable until illness rates rise. Navigation delay seems temporary until weather windows close. These are coupling events, separate issues becoming mutually reinforcing. In modern terms, Franklin can be read as a coupling crisis under extreme environmental constraint. The lesson is not that planning is futile. The lesson is that planning must include adaptive pathways for conditions that violate baseline assumptions. Systems survive uncertainty by updating models quickly, not by defending initial models at all costs. Back home, anxiety hardened into policy. Families pressed for action. Institutions launched searches. Public attention fluctuated between hope and dread. Lady Jane Franklin's persistent advocacy helped sustain momentum. Search campaigns multiplied and generated major cartographic gains. Even as rescue failed, this created a painful contradiction. Geographic clarity increased while human outcomes remained unresolved. Progress on maps did not equal closure for families. Search expeditions are often narrated through routes and outcomes, but they also transform institutions that run them. Budgets shift. Careers rise and stall. Public expectations recalibrate. Scientific methods evolve. Franklin's absence generated administrative persistence that outlasted immediate rescue hope, demonstrating how unresolved high-profile cases can reshape policy priorities over years. At the same time, families live on a different clock. Institutional milestones, new chart sectors, improved route estimates, recovered objects, do not align with emotional closure. This temporal mismatch is one reason the Franklin story remained culturally active long after practical rescue was impossible. Inuit testimony offered critical observations. Material traces, encounters, route-relevant information, and environmental understanding shaped by deep regional continuity. Some searchers listened, others dismissed or mistranslated what they heard. Modern reassessment places Inuit knowledge where it belongs, central, not peripheral. This is not symbolic inclusion. It is methodological correction. The Franklin story includes a knowledge failure. Critical insight existed, but institutions were slow to trust it. Epistemic hierarchy determines operational reality. If a system treats certain voices as inherently less credible, it will process useful warnings too slowly. In Arctic contexts, where local environmental interpretation can be life-critical, such delay can be fatal. Franklin's legacy includes this governance lesson. Knowledge legitimacy is not an abstract ethical debate. It is a safety variable. Correcting that lesson today means more than acknowledgments. It means building mixed evidence workflows where oral testimony, field observation, archival data, and material analysis are evaluated together with clear methods. The strongest histories emerge when source traditions are compared, not ranked by inherited prestige. Evidence points to extreme hardship and multi-factor decline. Lead exposure has been debated. Nutritional stress and disease burdens are also central. Cold and exhaustion intensified all vulnerabilities. The strongest model remains convergence, not singular cause. Sensitive evidence historically tied to late-stage starvation behavior must be treated without sensational framing. Precision here means refusing simplistic certainty. Forensics can narrow possibilities while still leaving causal ambiguity. This is normal, not failure. Biological signals rarely map cleanly to single historical narratives without context. Environmental exposure, baseline variability, sampling limits, and interpretive frameworks all shape conclusions. Therefore, multi-cause models are often not evasive. They are accurate representations of complex reality. A mature documentary can make that intellectually satisfying by showing how uncertainty itself is structured. Not all unknowns are equal. Some are likely to be resolved with further data. Others may remain indeterminate due to permanent evidence loss. Distinguishing those categories gives viewers clarity without false certainty. The move toward the Back River region after abandonment represented a drastic shift from ship-based endurance to exposed overland survival. Distance, wind, load, caloric deficit, and declining cognition made progress brutally expensive. Evidence does not support a single theatrical endpoint. Staggered attrition is more consistent with available records. This chapter must be narrated as process, not spectacle. To understand why expeditions fail, it helps to examine decision pressure as a moving target. Early in a mission, choices are made with higher reserves, broader morale, and stronger optionality. Later choices are made with fewer reserves, narrower morale, and reduced optionality. The quality of a late decision cannot be judged as if it were made under early conditions. This matters in Franklin analysis because many debates implicitly assume stable decision capacity across years. That is unlikely. Prolonged cold stress, medical burden, and repeated uncertainty, events alter cognitive bandwidth and organizational tolerance for experimentation. What appears from hindsight as an obvious pivot may have seemed, in the moment, too risky, too late, or simply unworkable given available strength. There is also the issue of signal ambiguity. In severe environments, not every warning can be distinguished from normal hardship in real time. If teams react to every anomaly as existential, they can exhaust themselves through overcorrection. If they underreact, risks couple silently. Good command requires balance, but balance gets harder as fatigue rises. Therefore, responsible narration should avoid binary judgments like they should have known, unless evidence is explicit. A stronger formulation is, what information was likely visible? What constraints shaped interpretation? And how did those constraints evolve as options contracted? This framework preserves accountability while respecting historical reality. A stronger formulation is, what information was likely visible? What constraints shaped interpretation? And how did those constraints evolve as options contracted? This framework preserves accountability while respecting historical reality. Searches transformed Arctic charts and operational knowledge, yet that achievement coexisted with unresolved loss. The Franklin legacy is therefore dual: expansion of geographic understanding and persistence of human uncertainty. The search era also changed the operating grammar of Arctic missions. Routes were no longer imagined only as lines between points, but as seasonal systems with recurring uncertainty zones, bottlenecks, and timing traps. Naval planners learned that success in high-latitude operations depends less on single moments of bravery and more on resilient logistics. Food rotation, fuel assumptions, medical margin, decision latency, and communication design. In that sense, the Franklin aftermath became a distributed classroom. It taught through cost. Every later expedition inherited that tuition, even when official narratives focused on glory rather than error budgets. Another legacy concerns evidence standards. Search parties produced fragments, reports, sightings, objects, oral accounts, and geographic traces. Individually, each fragment was fragile. Together, they forced a methodological shift from certainty claims toward confidence ranges. This is a critical historical upgrade. Mature investigation does not ask, "What is the one dramatic answer?" It asks, "Which explanations remain plausible under all currently available constraints?" Franklin research gradually moved in that direction, and modern audiences benefit from seeing that change explicitly. A third legacy is epistemic humility about whose knowledge counts. Inuit testimony repeatedly offered location, behavior, and survival-relevant detail that aligned with later material findings. Treating that testimony as secondary delayed understanding, the historical lesson is not symbolic inclusion. It is performance quality. Systems that ignore local expertise reduce their own accuracy. Systems that integrate it early improve both speed and reliability. In frontier history, systems often learn most after failure. Search legacy is paradox by design. The same process that failed to recover everyone quickly generated durable geographic knowledge. This is not hypocrisy. It is tragic asymmetry. Institutions can learn structurally while individuals remain unrecovered. Connect this to modern systems language. Post-failure learning is often rapid, but morally costly. Franklin sits inside that pattern and helps audiences recognize it in contemporary domains, from disaster response to infrastructure planning. Franklin became symbolic terrain. One narrative elevates duty and endurance. Another emphasizes imperial hubris and epistemic blind spots. Each captures part of the truth. Neither resolves all contradictions. Memory work around Franklin is not static remembrance. It is active selection. Different generations inherit the same event, but ask different moral questions. One era asks what courage looks like under impossible conditions. Another asks how confidence became overconfidence. Another asks how institutional prestige shaped what evidence was trusted. None of these questions is illegitimate. Problems begin when one frame claims monopoly and erases the rest. This is why documentary ethics matters here. We should not turn uncertainty into melodrama, and we should not hide uncertainty to produce cleaner storytelling. A responsible narrative can hold multiple truths at once. Officers acted within severe constraints. Institutions still carried blind spots. Local knowledge was available but undervalued. Later science clarified some claims, while leaving others unresolved. Complexity is not a weakness in the story. It is the story. National narratives often seek closure because closure is emotionally efficient. But historical literacy asks for a different skill: staying with partial knowledge without collapsing into cynicism. Franklin's long afterlife teaches that mature public memory is less about choosing heroes or villains and more about improving judgment. Which warnings were visible? Which assumptions were protected too long? Which corrective signals were discounted? Those questions connect directly to modern systems, from emergency response to climate adaptation. The value of this story lies in complexity retained, not complexity erased. Memory politics deserve explicit treatment. National narratives tend to stabilize around emotionally useful versions of events. Franklin has supported multiple useful versions over time: Stoic sacrifice, imperial warning, scientific perseverance, bureaucratic cautionary tale. Each selects, emphasizes, and omits. The documentary's role is not to replace one simplification with another. It is to hold contradiction without collapsing into indecision. Complexity presented clearly is not confusion, it is fidelity. Wreck discoveries expanded what can be tested materially: artifact context, spatial relationships, and ship condition. But archaeology is slow evidence practice, not instant closure. Conservation, interpretation, and cross-disciplinary synthesis continue. Discovery is continuation. Wreck rediscovery should be narrated as evidence acceleration, not narrative closure. Material context now allows stronger testing of hypotheses that previously relied on fragmentary inference. But even with better data, some questions remain bounded by loss. Emphasize process: survey, conservation, interpretation, revision. Also emphasize stewardship and collaboration as part of epistemic quality, not public relations add-on. Who participates in knowledge production affects what is found and how it is understood. Franklin's relevance is not confined to maritime history. The pattern appears across modern systems. Infrastructure stressed beyond design assumptions, institutions slow to integrate external expertise, and communication cultures that reward confidence over contingency planning. Climate adaptation, supply chain resilience, and emergency governance all face this challenge. The enduring value of the Franklin case is therefore practical. It teaches that preparedness must be paired with adaptive governance, that uncertainty should be surfaced early, not buried, and that evidence quality improves when multiple knowledge systems are integrated, rather than staged in hierarchy. These are contemporary operational principles, not retrospective moral gestures. If the documentary lands this connection clearly, the story stops being only about what happened in the 19th century and becomes a guide for how complex systems should behave under 21st century uncertainty. Arctic travel narratives are often edited for pace, but lived Arctic movement is defined by delay. Wind can pin progress for hours. Surface conditions can force detours that look minor on maps, but costly in energy. Visibility shifts can compress decision windows and increase navigation error. In prolonged operations, these micro-delays accumulate into strategic consequences: missed seasonal windows, reduced margin, and elevated dependence on shrinking reserves. This is why environmental context should be narrated not as backdrop, but as active force. Ice is not scenery. It is structure, hazard, and timing mechanism. It determines what options exist, when they exist, and how quickly they disappear. A documentary that keeps this visible helps audiences understand how competent planning can still be overtaken without requiring dramatic incompetence. Historical reconstruction under uncertainty is a craft of limits. The strongest claims are anchored to documented dates, artifacts in context, and convergent sources. Medium confidence claims rely on plausible inference with explicit caveats. Low confidence zones should remain low confidence, even when narrative pressure pushes for completion. This hierarchy protects both truth and storytelling. Audiences can follow uncertainty when uncertainty is explained clearly. In fact, clarity about limits often increases trust, because viewers can see where evidence is firm and where interpretation begins. The Franklin record rewards this discipline. It punishes overreach. The Franklin expedition now sits between stronger evidence and enduring limits. We can anchor more than before, yet not everything. Some details are recoverable, others are not. The responsible ending is methodological. Say what is known clearly, label what is uncertain plainly, and resist myth where evidence is incomplete. When confidence meets the unknown, adaptation matters more than assumption. End on method and humility. The Franklin expedition should leave the audience with practical historical literacy. Confidence is useful, but only when paired with adaptive listening and model revision under stress. Knowledge hierarchies are not neutral. They shape outcomes. And uncertainty, when honestly labeled, is not a weakness in storytelling. It is a strength. The final question should linger as a modern operational test. When systems enter conditions beyond assumption, do they defend prior models or do they reconfigure quickly enough to survive? Push this reflection one layer deeper. The Franklin story is not only about what happened in the Arctic, it is about how institutions narrate themselves after high-cost uncertainty. In almost every era, systems prefer stories that preserve identity coherence. Heroic framing does this. Villain framing does this too. Both can be emotionally satisfying, and both can hide the operational lessons that matter most. A mature closing should resist that temptation. It should keep viewers inside disciplined ambiguity. Some decisions were reasonable under available information, some assumptions were brittle, and multiple warning channels existed but were unevenly weighted. This is where historical method becomes civic method. When we watch a case like Franklin, we are training contemporary judgment, not merely consuming period drama. The transferable questions are practical. What assumptions did planners treat as stable that later proved unstable? Which signals arrived early but were discounted as noise? Which signals arrived late but were overweighted because they fit existing expectations? And most importantly, what mechanisms existed for model revision once conditions diverged from plan? These are not abstract academic prompts. They are core design questions for modern infrastructure, emergency response, maritime safety, and any high-stakes operation under environmental volatility. Notice also the human-scale asymmetry that archives cannot fully repair. We can reconstruct routes with increasing precision. We can infer diet stress, material degradation, and movement constraints. We can map where confidence narrowed and where options collapsed, but private interior experience largely remains inaccessible. We do not have full emotional transcripts of fear, loyalty, conflict, or hope in the final phases. Responsible storytelling should acknowledge that absence directly. It is not a defect in the documentary. It is a truthful boundary of evidence. Admitting that boundary protects dignity better than fictional certainty ever could. Another closing duty is temporal honesty. Discovery events in 2014 and 2016 expanded evidence confidence, but they did not transform uncertainty into total closure. Archaeology, conservation, interpretation, and cross-disciplinary analysis move at different speeds. Public attention moves faster. The gap between those tempos creates pressure for premature conclusions. Premium, factual work should model a different rhythm. Careful update, explicit confidence language, and willingness to leave selected questions open when evidence remains bounded. That is not narrative weakness. That is epistemic strength translated into audience trust. If we pull back further, Franklin illustrates a recurring systems pattern. Capability can be high while adaptability remains insufficient. The expedition launched with serious preparation, technical competence, and institutional backing. Yet, preparedness and adaptability are not interchangeable. Preparedness optimizes for expected conditions. Adaptability preserves function when conditions violate assumptions. Failures in extreme environments often emerge when organizations overinvest in the first and underdesign the second. This pattern remains visible far beyond the 19th century. So the final message to the viewer should be concrete. Do not leave with a single dramatic cause. Leave with a better model of complex failure and complex learning. Multiple stressors can couple. Partial evidence can still support robust inference when confidence is labeled correctly. Local knowledge is not a symbolic add-on. It is often operationally decisive. Narrative closure can be emotionally efficient yet analytically expensive, and humility in historical interpretation is not passivity. It is active discipline about what can and cannot be claimed. End with one clean line of practical literacy. Under uncertainty, credibility belongs to systems that update faster than their myths. The Franklin expedition remains compelling because it exposes what happens when adaptation lags behind confidence, and because it shows how difficult, slow, and necessary honest revision can be. Behind every institutional narrative are individual lives reduced by archive survival. Some names are preserved. Many inner lives are not. We can reconstruct routes, infer stress, and analyze systems, yet still fail to recover the emotional texture of final months. The private fears, loyalties, and moments of ordinary routine that persist even during crisis. Acknowledging that absence is not sentimental, it is ethical. It prevents history from turning people into symbols only. The Franklin expedition should be remembered as both structural lesson and human loss. A reminder that large strategic projects are ultimately lived at the scale of breath, hunger, fatigue, and hope. Franklin's legacy extends into modern planning because the structure of failure is familiar. Many contemporary systems are technically sophisticated, yet vulnerable to compounding stress outside design assumptions. Supply chains optimized for efficiency can become fragile under disruption. Infrastructure calibrated to historical climate baselines can underperform in new extremes. Bureaucracies tuned for routine can delay adaptation during fast-moving crises. 3 lessons emerge clearly. First, resilience is not the same as initial capability. It is the ability to reconfigure under stress without collapse. Second, information diversity is a safety feature. Systems that discount certain knowledge sources increase blind spot risk. Third, uncertainty communication is operational, not cosmetic. When leaders hide ambiguity to preserve confidence, they often reduce the organization's adaptive speed. Applied back to Franklin, these lessons are not anachronistic judgment. They are analytical bridges. The expedition becomes more than a historical tragedy. It becomes a training case in adaptive governance. That is why this story remains useful. It forces us to ask whether our current institutions are truly designed to learn in time, or only to explain afterward. One final practical takeaway deserves to remain with the audience after the credits. In high uncertainty operations, the most dangerous failure mode is not ignorance. It is delayed adaptation while confidence language remains unchanged. Teams can be competent, disciplined, and well-resourced, yet still drift into collapse if feedback loops are slow and dissent signals are discounted. Franklin matters because it demonstrates that gap with unusual clarity. The ethical response is not dramatic certainty, but operational honesty. Update assumptions early, name uncertainty precisely, integrate local expertise, and protect decision pathways that can change course before margins disappear. If this documentary leaves viewers with one durable skill, let it be this: when evidence and expectations diverge, credibility belongs to those who revise fastest without losing rigor.